The coffee was barely lukewarm when Linda Rodriguez slammed the pot down hard enough to rattle every cup on the counter. Her eyes locked onto the man in the corner booth, the one who'd been sitting there for 10 minutes, slowly counting out crumpled dollar bills like each one was a small treasure. His weathered military surplus jacket hung loose on his frame, and his beard needed a barber's attention. But what really bothered Linda was the way he made her other customers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Sir, I need you to settle up and move along," she announced, her voice cutting through the morning chatter of Sunset Diner like a knife through butter. The man looked up, his tired brown eyes meeting hers with a calmness that seemed out of place for someone being publicly humiliated. He had exactly $8.47 spread across the worn Formica table, and he'd ordered the breakfast special that cost $6.99. "I haven't ordered yet, ma'am," Marcus Thompson said quietly, his voice carrying just the faintest trace of an accent that might have been from anywhere south of the Mason-Dixon line. "I was hoping for some coffee, and maybe those eggs you advertise in the window." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His fingers moved to gather the bills, arranging them with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly what each dollar meant. Linda's expression hardened. She'd been running this diner for 12 years, ever since her husband passed, and she knew trouble when she saw it. This wasn't the first time someone had wandered in off Main Street, looking like they'd been sleeping rough, trying to stretch a few dollars into a warm meal and hours of shelter. Listen, this isn't a homeless shelter. You can't just camp out here nursing a cup of coffee all morning while paying customers need tables. The businessman in the next booth, Robert Hayes, glanced up from his smartphone and nodded approvingly. He'd been watching the situation unfold while scrolling through stock prices, and frankly, he agreed with the restaurant owner. Places like this needed to maintain standards, especially during the breakfast rush when legitimate customers needed service. But Jessica Miller, the young server who'd been working at Sunset Diner for 3 years while putting herself through nursing school, felt her stomach twist with discomfort. Something about the way the man held himself, the straightness of his posture, despite his obvious exhaustion, reminded her of her brother Jake, who was currently deployed overseas. There was a dignity in his bearing that didn't match his appearance, and she found herself stepping forward. "Mrs. Rodriguez, he just wants to order breakfast," Jess said softly, glancing between her boss and the customer. "He's got the money right there." Linda whirled around, her face flushed with irritation. "Jessica, this is my establishment, and I decide who we serve. Look at him. Look at his clothes, his condition. He's obviously homeless, probably hasn't bathed in days, and I won't have him making my regular customers uncomfortable." The words hung in the air like smoke from the grill, and Marcus felt something familiar settle in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd carried through months of transitional housing, job interviews where potential employers took one look at his address and found reasons to pass, and countless small interactions where people made assumptions based on what they saw rather than who he was. He'd learned not to fight these battles anymore. They cost too much energy he didn't have. "It's all right," Marcus said, beginning to stand. His movements were careful, controlled, like someone who'd learned to make himself smaller to avoid confrontation. "I understand." But as he rose from the booth, his worn backpack caught on the edge of the table, and several items scattered to the floor. A small notebook, a plastic bottle of prescription medication, and something else that rolled under the adjacent table with a distinct metallic sound. Marcus dropped to his knees immediately, his face showing the first real emotion since the confrontation began: panic. Tony Carboni, the cook who'd been watching from behind the grill, stepped around the counter. He was a big man with graying temples and hands that bore the scars of decades in commercial kitchens, and something about the customer's urgency struck him as significant. Tony had served 4 years in the Navy before finding his way into food service, and he recognized the careful way the man searched the floor, like he was looking for something irreplaceable. "Here, let me help," Tony said, getting down on his hands and knees beside the table. His fingers found the object that had rolled the furthest, and when he pulled it into the light, his breath caught. It was a challenge coin, but not just any challenge coin. The distinctive eagle and parachute design of the 82nd Airborne Division was unmistakable, but it was the additional markings around the edge that made Tony's hands shake slightly as he held it. Special Operations, Combat Infantry Badge. And inscribed along the bottom edge, so small you'd have to know to look for it, were the words that made Tony's throat tighten. For valor above and beyond. Marcus reached for the coin with hands that trembled just slightly, and Tony saw something in his eyes that he recognized from his own reflection during the hard years after discharge. The look of someone carrying weight that others couldn't see, fighting battles that didn't have front lines or clear objectives. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, closing his fingers around the coin like it was a lifeline. "I'm sorry for the disturbance." Linda Rodriguez had been watching this exchange with growing impatience, but something about the way the cook was staring at the homeless man made her pause. Tony had never been one for drama or sentiment, but his expression had changed completely. He looked like he'd seen something that shook him to his core. "Tony, what's wrong with you?" she demanded. "Help me get him out of here before the lunch crowd starts coming in." But Tony didn't move. He was studying Marcus with new eyes, taking in details he'd missed before. The way the man's shoulders squared despite his exhaustion. The careful economy of his movements, like someone trained to conserve energy for when it mattered most. The fact that his boots, though worn, were clean and well-maintained. And most importantly, the challenge coin that no civilian would carry, especially not one with those particular markings. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Tony said slowly, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "I think maybe we should slow down here." Linda's patience snapped completely. She'd built her business by making quick decisions and sticking to them, and she wasn't about to let her cook undermine her authority in front of customers. "No, Tony. I've made my decision." "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Now." The diner had gone quiet except for the hiss of the grill and the low hum of the coffee machine. Frank and Dorothy Williams, the elderly couple who came in every Tuesday morning for the senior discount breakfast, exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sarah Bennett, the young mother trying to manage her toddler while grabbing a quick bite before work, found herself watching the scene with growing unease. Marcus stood slowly, shouldering his backpack with movements that spoke of long practice in packing up quickly and moving on. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't do anything except nod once to Tony, who was still holding his gaze with an intensity that seemed to communicate something beyond words. "I appreciate you trying to help," Marcus said to the cook. "Take care of yourself." He was 3 steps from the door when the sound of vehicles pulling up outside made everyone in the diner turn toward the windows. 3 black SUVs with government plates had arranged themselves in the parking lot with military precision, and men and women in dress uniforms were stepping out, with the kind of coordinated movement that suggested this wasn't a social visit. Jessica pressed her face to the window, her heart suddenly racing. "Mrs. Rodriguez, there are soldiers outside. A lot of them." Linda felt a cold dread beginning to form in her stomach, but she pushed it down. This was probably just a coincidence. Military personnel stopped at roadside diners all the time, especially this close to Fort Harrison. It had nothing to do with the homeless man she'd just asked to leave. But Colonel James Mitchell wasn't heading toward the diner for a casual breakfast. He was scanning the parking lot and the street beyond with the systematic attention of someone looking for a specific person. His aide, Captain Lisa Anderson, was checking her tablet while Staff Sergeant Michael Torres coordinated with the rest of their small convoy. "Sir, the GPS shows this is the location," Captain Anderson reported. Local police confirmed a man matching the description was seen in this area approximately 30 minutes ago. Colonel Mitchell nodded grimly. They'd been searching for Marcus Thompson for the better part of 2 hours, ever since he'd failed to appear at Fort Harrison for what was supposed to be one of the most important days of his life. The Veterans Memorial dedication ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 3 hours, and Marcus was meant to be the guest of honor. Not because he was a curiosity or a token, but because he was a genuine American hero whose story deserved to be told. Marcus had saved 12 soldiers during a Taliban ambush in Afghanistan's Kunar province, carrying wounded men through enemy fire while coordinating air support and holding a defensive position for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived. The Medal of Honor around his neck had been earned with blood and sacrifice, but that wasn't the Marcus Thompson the world had seen lately. The man who'd returned from 3 combat tours was fighting different battles now, against memories that wouldn't fade, and a civilian world that seemed determined to forget that heroes could struggle too. Inside the diner, Marcus had frozen at the sight of the military vehicles. His hand went instinctively to his pocket, where the challenge coin rested against his fingers like a talisman. He'd been AWOL from his own ceremony, lost in the kind of dark spiral that had become too familiar since his discharge. The idea of standing in front of crowds, accepting praise for actions that still gave him nightmares, had overwhelmed him. He'd walked out of his motel room that morning, intending to grab breakfast and return, but the miles had accumulated under his feet until he'd found himself in downtown Millbrook, exhausted and trying to disappear into the anonymity of a roadside diner. Colonel Mitchell pushed through the door of Sunset Diner with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to command, and the change in atmosphere was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Even the toddler in Sarah Bennett's arms seemed to sense that something significant was happening. "Excuse me," the colonel said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in uniform. "I'm looking for someone, and I have reason to believe he might have been here recently." Linda Rodriguez felt her mouth go dry, but she managed to step forward. "Of course, Colonel. How can we help you?" Colonel Mitchell's eyes swept the diner systematically, taking in every face, every detail. When his gaze landed on Marcus, who was standing frozen near the door like a deer caught in headlights, the colonel's expression shifted through surprise, relief, and something that might have been understanding. "Marcus," he said quietly, and the single word carried the weight of friendship, concern, and absolute respect. "We've been looking for you." The challenge coin in Marcus's pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He wanted to run, wanted to disappear back into the anonymous crowd of faces that populated the edges of small towns across America. But Colonel Mitchell wasn't just his commanding officer. He was the man who'd helped pull Marcus back from the brink when the nightmares first started, who'd sat with him through the worst of the PTSD episodes, who'd never once made him feel weak for struggling with demons that had no uniforms or clear targets. "I know," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, sir. I needed some air." Linda Rodriguez felt the world shifting beneath her feet as she began to understand what she was witnessing. The homeless man she'd just humiliated and thrown out of her restaurant was being treated with the kind of deference reserved for the most honored guests. The soldiers who'd entered behind Colonel Mitchell were standing at attention, but their posture wasn't just military courtesy, it was genuine respect. The morning sun streaming through the windows of Sunset Diner caught the dust motes, dancing in the air like tiny witnesses to a moment that would change everything for everyone present. Colonel Mitchell took a step closer to Marcus, his expression softening in a way that spoke of genuine care rather than military protocol. "Marcus, you missed the briefing," he said gently. "Captain Anderson has been trying to reach you for 2 hours. The ceremony starts at 1100, and there are people who've traveled from 3 states to be there, for you." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation that made breathing feel like work. "I know, sir. I don't think I can do this. Standing up there, having people look at me like I'm something special. Those men who didn't make it home, they were the heroes. I just happened to survive." The words hung in the air like a confession, and Linda Rodriguez felt something crack inside her chest. She'd spent the last 20 minutes treating this man like refuse, like someone whose presence diminished. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her establishment, and now she was watching a full colonel speak to him with the kind of respect she'd never seen directed toward anyone outside of movies. Tony Carbone stepped forward from behind the grill, his own military bearing becoming more apparent as he addressed Colonel Mitchell. "Sir, if I may, Petty Officer Second Class Anthony Carbone, retired Navy. I recognized his coin. The 82nd markings. Is this man who I think he is? Colonel Mitchell's eyes shifted to Tony, and he nodded slowly. Marcus Thompson, Medal of Honor recipient, scheduled to be the guest of honor at today's Veterans Memorial dedication in downtown Millbrook, though I suspect he'd rather I not announce that to the room. But it was too late. The words had carried clearly through the diner, and the effect was immediate. Frank Williams, the elderly man sharing breakfast with his wife, pushed slowly to his feet. His own military bearing became apparent as he straightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the tremor of age, but also unmistakable conviction. Son, he said, addressing Marcus directly, I served in Korea. 68th year since I came home, and I've never forgotten the faces of the men who didn't make it back with me. If someone like you, someone who risked everything to bring our boys home, can't stand up and be honored, then what hope do the rest of us have of being remembered? Dorothy Williams reached for her husband's hand, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Frank's right, dear. Some things are bigger than how we feel about ourselves. Marcus felt the walls of the diner closing in, not with hostility now, but with a kind of attention he'd never learned to handle. The weight of expectation, of other people's needs and hopes, pressed down on him like physical force. He'd been trained to carry wounded soldiers through enemy fire, to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for the men under his command. But this simple act of accepting recognition felt impossible. Jessica Miller had been watching this unfold with growing understanding, pieces clicking into place in her mind. The careful way Marcus had counted his money, the precision of his movements, the dignity that had never wavered even when her boss was humiliating him. Her brother Jake had written letters from Afghanistan describing men like this, soldiers who'd earned respect through actions rather than words, who carried their service like a private burden rather than a public badge. Sir, she said, addressing Marcus directly, my brother's deployed right now, 3rd tour, and he writes about guys like you, the ones who look out for everyone else. He says knowing there are people like you over there makes it easier for families like mine to sleep at night. The young server's words hit Marcus differently than the formal recognitions and official ceremonies. This was personal, immediate, connected to someone who was living the reality he'd left behind. For the first time since Colonel Mitchell had entered the diner, Marcus looked directly at the faces around him, really seeing them instead of looking through them. Sarah Bennett, still holding her toddler, had been listening with the intensity of someone whose own husband had deployed twice to Iraq before finding work as a civilian contractor. My daughter will grow up in a world that's safer because of what you did, she said simply. That matters. Linda Rodriguez felt like she was drowning in her own shame. Every word spoken in Marcus's defense was also an indictment of her treatment of him, a reminder that she'd judged a book by its cover and found it wanting, when the truth was she'd been too blind to read what was right in front of her. Her late husband had been a veteran too, Vietnam era, and he'd struggled with his own demons after returning home. She should have recognized the signs, should have seen past the surface appearance to the man beneath. I owe you an apology, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I was wrong. I was so wrong about you, and I'm sorry. Marcus looked at her with those same calm brown eyes that had met her hostility with patience 20 minutes earlier. You don't owe me anything, ma'am. You run a business. You have to make decisions. I understand. But Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, his expression hardening slightly. Actually, Mrs. Rodriguez, with respect, you do owe him something. This man has a Medal of Honor waiting for him at the Veterans Memorial. But more than that, he has a story that needs to be told. Not because he wants the attention, but because people need to understand what service really looks like. The colonel turned to address the entire diner, his voice carrying the authority of command but also the warmth of genuine conviction. Marcus Thompson spent 18 months in Afghanistan, leading convoy security through some of the most dangerous territory in the world. On March 15, 2018, his convoy was ambushed in Kunar province. Enemy fire from elevated positions, RPGs, small arms, coordinated attack designed to leave no survivors. Marcus's hands clenched involuntarily as the colonel spoke, the familiar images flashing behind his eyes like a movie he couldn't turn off. The sound of incoming rounds, the smell of burning fuel, the weight of Corporal Davis across his shoulders as he carried him to cover. Marcus coordinated defensive fire while treating wounded soldiers, Colonel Mitchell continued. He carried 12 men to safety under enemy fire, some of them multiple trips through the kill zone. He held that position for 6 hours, calling in air support and medevac, while Taliban fighters tried to overrun their defensive perimeter. By the time reinforcements arrived, he'd saved every man in that convoy who could be saved. The diner had gone completely silent, except for the low hum of the coffee machine and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. Even Sarah's toddler had stopped fussing, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. The Medal of Honor citation reads, "Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty," the colonel said. But what it doesn't capture is that Marcus has spent the last 4 years struggling with the memories of that day, fighting battles that don't have clear objectives or visible enemies. PTSD, transition difficulties, the challenge of finding his place in a civilian world that sometimes forgets that heroes are human beings too. Marcus felt tears he'd been holding back for months threatening to spill over. The colonel was right, of course. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way crowds made his skin crawl, the difficulty holding jobs when employers couldn't understand why he sometimes needed to step outside when helicopters flew overhead. He'd been living in the margins, taking temporary work and staying in transitional housing, trying to figure out how to be a person instead of a soldier. Tony Carbone wiped his hands on his apron, his own memories of military service, giving him insight into struggles that civilians often couldn't comprehend. "That's why you're here, isn't it?" he said to Marcus. "Not just for breakfast. You're running from the ceremony." Marcus nodded slowly. "I don't feel like a hero, Tony. I feel like someone who got lucky when better men didn't. Standing up there, accepting praise for doing what any of us would have done, it feels wrong. Like I'm stealing something that belongs to the guys who didn't make it home." Robert Hayes, the businessman who'd earlier approved of Linda's decision to eject Marcus from the diner, found himself reassessing everything he thought he understood about success and worth. Here was a man who'd earned the highest military decoration in the country, and he was questioning whether he deserved recognition for saving 12 lives. Meanwhile, Hayes spent his days moving money around and calling it achievement. "Son," Frank Williams said again, his voice stronger now, "I've carried survivor's guilt for 68 years, lost my best friend to Chinese artillery on Hill 314, and for decades I wondered why I made it home when Johnny didn't. You know what I learned? The best way to honor the dead is to live. Really live. And sometimes that means letting people say thank you." Dorothy Williams squeezed her husband's hand, remembering the young man who'd returned from Korea, carrying weights that took years to set down. "Frank's right, dear. The ceremony isn't about you feeling worthy. It's about giving other people a chance to say what needs to be said." Jessica refilled Marcus's coffee cup without being asked, her hands steady despite the emotion in her voice. "My brother Jake writes about moments like this in his letters. He says the hardest part isn't being brave in the moment, it's living with it afterward. But he also says that guys like you make it possible for guys like him to believe they can come home and still be whole." Captain Anderson had been standing quietly near the door, but now she stepped forward with her tablet. "Sir, we need to make a decision about the ceremony. There are media representatives, family members of the soldiers you saved, local officials, and about 300 veterans who've come specifically to honor you. We can postpone, but—" "No," Marcus said suddenly, surprising everyone, including himself. "No, we don't postpone. Those people took time out of their lives to be there. The families of the men I served with, they deserve to have their sons and husbands remembered properly." Colonel Mitchell smiled for the first time since entering the diner. "That's the Marcus Thompson I remember. always thinking about everyone else first. Linda Rodriguez had been listening to this exchange with growing determination. She'd made a terrible mistake, had treated a genuine American hero like garbage, but maybe there was still time to make it right. "Colonel Mitchell, how much time do we have before the ceremony?" The colonel checked his watch. "About 90 minutes. Linda turned to Tony, her expression decisive. "Can you handle breakfast for one more customer? The real breakfast this time, everything we do best." Tony's face split into the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all morning. "Yes, ma'am. I think I can manage that." "And, Jessica," Linda continued, "I want you to take care of Mr. Thompson personally. Whatever he needs, whatever he wants, it's on the house. Forever." Marcus started to protest, but Linda held up her hand. "Please, let me do this small thing. It won't make up for how I treated you, but it's a start." Frank Williams was still standing, and now he raised his coffee cup in a gesture that was part toast, part salute. "To the men who didn't make it home," he said clearly, "and to the ones who did, who carry them with us every day." Around the diner, other customers raised their cups, their voices joining in quiet agreement. Even Robert Hayes found himself participating, the businessman's usual cynicism temporarily suspended by the gravity of the moment. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. These people, strangers 20 minutes ago, were offering him something he'd been afraid to accept from anyone. Not pity, not charity, but simple human recognition of shared struggle and mutual respect. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady for the first time all morning. "All of you. This means more than you know." Colonel Mitchell clapped him gently on the shoulder. "Ready to go be a hero for a few hours?" Marcus looked around the diner one more time, at faces that had transformed from indifferent or hostile to supportive and understanding. "Yeah," he said finally, "I think I'm ready." As the military convoy prepared to escort Marcus to his moment of recognition, the Sunset Diner had become something more than just a place to grab breakfast. It had become a reminder that heroes walk among us every day, often invisible, until circumstances reveal their true nature. And sometimes, the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with simple human decency and the courage to see past surface appearances to the truth beneath. The convoy of black SUVs moved through downtown Millbrook like a presidential motorcade, drawing stares from pedestrians and causing drivers to slow down and crane their necks for a better look. In the lead vehicle, Marcus Thompson sat in the passenger seat, watching familiar street signs pass by while Colonel Mitchell navigated the route to Fort Harrison with practiced efficiency. The leather seats and climate control were a stark contrast to the cramped conditions Marcus had grown accustomed to in transitional housing, and he found himself hyper-aware of every comfort, every detail that separated this moment from his recent reality. "You know, Marcus," Colonel Mitchell said, glancing in the rearview mirror to catch sight of Captain Anderson reviewing ceremony notes on her tablet, "when we first started planning this dedication 6 months ago, the committee specifically requested you as the keynote speaker, not because you're the only Medal of Honor recipient in the region, but because your story represents something essential about service that people need to understand." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his fingers automatically moving to the challenge coin in his pocket. The metal was warm from his body heat, worn smooth from years of unconscious handling during moments of stress. "Sir, with respect, I'm not sure my story is one people want to hear. The aftermath isn't exactly inspirational material." Captain Anderson looked up from her tablet, her expression thoughtful. "Actually, sir, I think you might be surprised. The families of the soldiers you saved, they've all written letters specifically asking for this ceremony. Not because they want to put you on a pedestal, but because they want their sons and husbands remembered as part of something larger than just casualty reports." The landscape outside shifted from the compact downtown core of Millbrook to the more spread-out suburban areas that bordered Fort Harrison. Strip malls gave way to residential neighborhoods, and those eventually yielded to the open fields and military infrastructure that surrounded the base. Marcus had made this drive dozens of times during his service, but always as part of a unit, always with a clear mission and defined objectives. Today felt different, like he was traveling towards something he couldn't quite define. The memorial wall includes 43 names from this region, Colonel Mitchell continued, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when discussing matters of military significance. Men and women who died in service to their country over the past 20 years. The families wanted a dedication ceremony that honored not just the dead, but the living veterans who carry their memory forward. You represent that continuity, Marcus. The bridge between those who didn't make it home and those of us still fighting to find our place in the world they died protecting. Staff Sergeant Torres, riding in the second vehicle, was coordinating with base security through his radio, but Marcus could see him in the side mirror, occasionally glancing toward the lead car with an expression that suggested this wasn't just another official function for him either. Torres had served 2 tours in Iraq and understood the weight that came with surviving when others didn't, the invisible burden that no amount of medals or recognition could lift. The main gate of Fort Harrison appeared ahead, its imposing stone facade and military checkpoint, a familiar sight that should have been comforting but instead triggered Marcus's hypervigilance. His shoulders tensed involuntarily as they approached the guards, even though he knew the convoy's arrival was expected and cleared through multiple levels of security. The automatic response frustrated him, this inability to simply relax in situations that posed no real threat. But Dr. Reyes at the VA had explained that trauma responses didn't follow logical patterns. "Marcus," Colonel Mitchell said quietly, noticing the change in his passenger's demeanor, "you don't have to be anyone other than yourself today. The ceremony isn't about performing heroism for the cameras. It's about acknowledging truth, both the sacrifices that were made and the ongoing struggle to honor them properly." The base itself spread out before them like a small city, with administrative buildings, barracks, training facilities, and family housing arranged in the orderly patterns that define military installations. Marcus had spent enough time here during his active duty to navigate it in his sleep, but returning as a civilian guest felt surreal, like visiting a place from a dream that had turned out to be real after all. Captain Anderson's tablet chimed with an incoming message, and she frowned as she read the contents. "Sir, we're getting word that the media presence is larger than anticipated. Local news stations, some regional outlets, and apparently a documentary crew that's been following Medal of Honor recipients for a project about post-service transition challenges." Marcus felt his chest tighten again. "Documentary crew? Colonel, nobody mentioned anything about being filmed." "It's your choice," Colonel Mitchell replied immediately. "We can restrict media access, limit coverage to still photography, whatever you're comfortable with. But Marcus, and I'm speaking as your friend now rather than your commanding officer, these stories matter. Not the sanitized versions that make war look glorious, but the real stories about what it costs and how we deal with that cost afterward." The convoy passed the main administrative complex and headed toward the newer section of the base, where the Veterans Memorial had been constructed. Marcus could see the construction cranes being removed in the distance, the final touches being applied to a project that had taken 3 years to complete. The memorial itself was designed as a living space, rather than just a monument, with seating areas and landscaping that invited contemplation rather than simply commanding reverence. "The families have been here since yesterday," Captain Anderson reported, scrolling through updates on her tablet. "The Hendricks family drove up from Houston, the Morettis flew in from Phoenix, and Corporal Davis's parents came down from Oklahoma. They specifically requested time to speak with you privately before the ceremony if you're willing." Marcus felt his throat constrict at the mention of Corporal Davis. Tommy Davis had been 22 years old, fresh out of infantry training, eager to prove himself in combat. He'd been riding in the third vehicle when the ambush began, and Marcus could still remember the weight of the young soldier across his shoulders as he carried him to cover, the way Tommy had kept apologizing for being wounded, as if it were somehow his fault. "He didn't make it," Marcus said quietly, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Tommy Davis. I got him to the aid station, but the internal bleeding was too severe. He died while the medics were working on him." Colonel Mitchell pulled the convoy to a stop in the parking area near the memorial site, but he didn't immediately get out. Instead, he turned to face Marcus directly, his expression serious but compassionate. "Marcus, Tommy Davis's parents know exactly what happened that day. They've read the after-action reports, they've spoken with the other survivors, and they've been fighting for 3 years to make sure their son's sacrifice is remembered properly. They don't blame you for his death. They credit you with making sure he didn't die alone and forgotten in a ditch in Afghanistan." The distinction mattered, Marcus realized, even though it didn't ease the guilt he carried. There was a difference between dying in combat and dying surrounded by people who cared enough to risk their own lives trying to save you. He'd been able to give Tommy Davis that much, even if he couldn't give him a trip home. Captain Anderson was reviewing the ceremony schedule on her tablet, coordinating timing with the various participants and support staff. "Sir, the program begins with remarks from General Peterson, followed by the unveiling of the memorial wall. Then there's a moment of silence, presentation of wreaths by family members, and finally your address to close the ceremony." "How long do I need to speak?" Marcus asked, realizing he hadn't prepared anything formal for the occasion. "As long or as short as feels right," Colonel Mitchell replied. "This isn't a political event or a recruiting speech. It's a conversation between people who understand loss and sacrifice. Speak from the heart, and don't worry about saying the perfect thing." The parking area was already filling with vehicles as families, veterans, and official guests arrived for the ceremony. Marcus could see news vans setting up equipment, their satellite dishes extending like mechanical flowers reaching toward the sky. A small group of protesters had gathered near the main entrance, their signs advocating for better veteran services and mental health support. Issues that Marcus knew firsthand were desperately needed but politically complicated to address. "Those protesters," he said, nodding toward the group, "they're not wrong about the problems. Maybe they should be the ones speaking today instead of me." Staff Sergeant Torres had approached the lead vehicle and was standing near Colonel Mitchell's door, waiting for instructions. Through the open window, Marcus could hear fragments of radio chatter, coordinating security and logistics for the event. The military precision was comforting in its familiarity, but it also reminded him of how far removed he'd become from this world of clear hierarchies and defined purposes. "Marcus," Colonel Mitchell said, his voice taking on the tone he'd used during their private conversations about Marcus's struggles with civilian transition, "those protesters are fighting the same fight you are, just from a different angle. They're advocating for systemic changes that could help veterans like you find better support and recognition. Your story gives weight to their arguments because you've lived the reality they're trying to change." A knock on the passenger window interrupted their conversation, and Marcus looked up to see a middle-aged woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes standing beside the vehicle. She was wearing a simple black dress with a small gold star pin on the lapel, the unmistakable symbol of a Gold Star mother who had lost a child in military service. Colonel Mitchell rolled down the window, and the woman leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me, Colonel, but if this is Sergeant Thompson, I'm Janet Davis, Tommy's mother. I was hoping we might have a few minutes to talk before the ceremony begins." Marcus felt the familiar weight settle in his chest, the heaviness that came with facing the families of the men he hadn't been able to save. But Janet Davis's expression wasn't accusatory or grief-stricken in the way he'd expected. Instead, she looked at him with something that might have been gratitude, mixed with the kind of understanding that only came from shared loss. "Mrs. Davis," Marcus said, stepping out of the vehicle despite his reluctance, "I'm so sorry about Tommy. He was a good soldier, a good man. I should have been able to do more." Janet Davis reached out and took his hands in hers, her grip firm and warm. "Sergeant Thompson, my son wrote letters home about you. He said you looked out for the younger soldiers, made sure they understood their jobs, and felt confident about their abilities. He said you treated him like a little brother instead of just another recruit." The words hit Marcus harder than any criticism could have. He remembered Tommy's enthusiasm, the way the young soldier had peppered him with questions about combat tactics and unit procedures. Tommy had been eager to learn, hungry for the kind of mentorship that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe in combat situations. Tommy also wrote about the day he died, Janet continued, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. Not the details of the fighting, but about how you stayed with him afterward. How you held his hand while the medics worked. How you promised him that his family would know he'd served with honor. He was conscious long enough to hear that, Sergeant Thompson. My son died knowing that someone he respected was making sure he wouldn't be forgotten. Marcus felt tears threatening for the second time that day, but this time they weren't tears of shame or guilt. Janet Davis was offering him something he'd never thought to hope for: absolution from someone who had the right to grant it. The mother of the soldier he'd failed to save was telling him that his efforts had mattered, that Tommy's final moments had been shaped by compassion rather than abandonment. Mrs. Davis, I don't know what to say. I've carried the weight of that day for so long, wondering if I could have done something different, something more. You did exactly what you were supposed to do, she replied firmly. You fought for every man in your unit, you risked your own life repeatedly to save others, and you made sure that even the soldiers you couldn't save died with dignity and respect. That's not failure, Sergeant Thompson. That's heroism. Other family members had begun to gather around the parking area, drawn by the sight of the military convoy and the growing media presence. Marcus could see people holding photographs, wearing memorial pins, carrying flowers for the wreath ceremony. Each face represented a story of loss and remembrance, a family's effort to ensure their loved one's sacrifice maintained meaning beyond the official casualty reports. Colonel Mitchell had stepped out of the vehicle and was coordinating with the ceremony staff, but Marcus could see him keeping one eye on the conversation with Janet Davis. The colonel understood the importance of these moments between survivors and families, the healing that could happen when people were allowed to speak honestly about loss and survival, without the filter of official military language. Mrs. Davis, Marcus said, his voice stronger now, would you mind if I mentioned Tommy in my remarks today? Not just his name on the memorial wall, but something about who he was as a person? Janet Davis smiled for the first time since approaching the vehicle, and Marcus could see echoes of her son's enthusiasm in her expression. I would be honored. Tommy always said he wanted to make a difference, wanted his service to matter for something larger than himself. Having his story told by someone who knew him, who served beside him, that would mean everything to our family. Captain Anderson approached with her tablet and a folder of ceremony materials, but she waited respectfully for the conversation to conclude before interrupting. The media crews were setting up their equipment in designated areas, and Marcus could see photographers adjusting their lenses and checking lighting conditions. In 30 minutes, this private moment of connection and healing would become a public ceremony with all the formality and protocol that military events required. Sergeant Thompson, Janet Davis said, preparing to rejoin her family. There's something else Tommy wrote in his last letter home. He said that serving under leaders like you made him proud to wear the uniform, proud to be part of something that stood for protecting others. He said you taught him that courage wasn't about not being afraid, but about doing what needed to be done despite the fear. Marcus watched Janet Davis walk back toward the group of Gold Star families, her shoulders straight with the kind of strength that came from transforming grief into purpose. He realized that his own understanding of heroism had been too narrow, too focused on dramatic moments of combat action, rather than the quieter acts of leadership and compassion that actually defined military service. Ready for this? Colonel Mitchell asked, rejoining Marcus near the vehicle. Marcus looked around at the families gathering for the ceremony, the veterans wearing their dress uniforms or service organization caps, the media representatives preparing to document the event, and the protesters still advocating for better veteran services near the main entrance. All of these people had gathered because they believed that military service and sacrifice deserved recognition and remembrance, but also because they understood that such recognition came with obligations to the living as well as the dead. Yeah, Marcus said, straightening his shoulders in a gesture that recalled his military bearing. I think I'm ready. The memorial site itself was more impressive than Marcus had expected, with a central plaza surrounded by landscaped areas and seating designed for both large ceremonies and intimate family visits. The memorial wall was constructed from black granite, similar to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, but designed to accommodate names from multiple conflicts and time periods. The newest section, dedicated to the global war on terror, included 43 names from the local region, representing lives lost in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations where American forces had served since 2001. Marcus found Tommy Davis's name etched into the granite near the center of the newest section, the letters cut deep and filled with gold leaf that would catch sunlight and remain visible even in harsh weather conditions. Seeing the name rendered in permanent stone gave Tommy's death a different kind of reality, transforming it from a painful memory into a lasting tribute that future generations would encounter and hopefully understand. The ceremony grounds were filling with attendees, and Marcus recognized several faces from his own military service, veterans who had traveled significant distances to participate in the dedication. Some nodded respectfully in his direction, while others maintained the kind of respectful distance that military culture prescribed for formal occasions. The mix of active duty personnel, veterans, family members, and civilians created an atmosphere that felt both solemn and celebratory, acknowledging loss while affirming the values that made such sacrifice meaningful. General Peterson arrived with his own small entourage, his presence immediately recognizable to the military personnel present. Peterson had commanded forces in Afghanistan during some of the heaviest fighting, and his reputation for caring about individual soldiers rather than just strategic objectives had earned him respect throughout the Army. Marcus had never served directly under Peterson, but he knew the general's reputation for visiting wounded soldiers and attending funeral services for fallen troops. "Sergeant Thompson," General Peterson said, approaching with the kind of direct manner that senior officers used when they wanted to cut through protocol and speak personally. "I've been looking forward to meeting you for quite some time. Your actions in Kunar province exemplify the best traditions of military service, but more importantly, your willingness to participate in today's ceremony demonstrates the kind of character that makes such actions possible." Marcus felt the familiar discomfort that came with praise for his military service, but General Peterson's words carried a different weight than the usual platitudes about heroism and valor. The general seemed to understand that Marcus's presence at the ceremony required its own kind of courage, a willingness to be vulnerable in public about experiences that most people preferred to keep private. "Thank you, sir. I hope I can do justice to the men we're remembering today." "You already have," General Peterson replied. "By surviving, by struggling with the aftermath, by continuing to care about your fellow soldiers even when it would be easier to forget. That's not comfortable heroism, Sergeant Thompson, but it's real heroism, the kind that matters long after the shooting stops." The media crews had completed their setup and were now documenting the pre-ceremony interactions, their cameras capturing conversations between family members, veterans greeting each other, and official personnel coordinating final details. Marcus noticed that the documentary crew Captain Anderson had mentioned was focusing primarily on the human moments rather than the formal protocol, interviewing Gold Star mothers and veteran attendees about what the memorial meant to them personally. A young reporter approached Marcus with a microphone and camera operator, but Colonel Mitchell intercepted them smoothly. "Sergeant Thompson will be available for interviews after the ceremony," he explained diplomatically. "Right now, he needs to focus on preparing his remarks and connecting with the families." Marcus felt grateful for the protection, but he also realized that avoiding media attention entirely wasn't realistic or necessarily appropriate. If his story could help other veterans feel less alone in their struggles, or help civilians understand the long-term costs of military service, then perhaps the discomfort of public attention was worth enduring. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes, and Marcus could see staff members making final preparations around the memorial site. Audio equipment was being tested, seating areas were being arranged for family members and VIP guests, and security personnel were establishing perimeters that would allow for both public access and dignified privacy for the families. Captain Anderson approached with a folder containing Marcus's speaking notes and ceremony schedule. "Sir, you're scheduled to speak for approximately 10 minutes following the wreath presentations. The microphone system is wireless, so you'll have mobility on the platform, and there's a lectern if you prefer to have something to hold on to." Marcus accepted the folder but didn't open it immediately. He'd decided during the conversation with Janet Davis that his remarks needed to be personal rather than formal, drawn from his actual memories of the men being honored, rather than from prepared talking points about service and sacrifice. "Captain, would it be possible to have the names of all 43 service members available while I'm speaking? I'd like to acknowledge them individually rather than just collectively." "Of course, sir. I can have that list ready for you, along with brief service summaries, if you think that would be helpful." "Just the names and ranks," Marcus replied. "Let their families tell their stories." The memorial ceremony at Fort Harrison represented more than just another military event or public recognition of service and sacrifice. For Marcus Thompson, it marked a transition from survivor's guilt to survivor's responsibility, from hiding from his experiences to acknowledging them as part of a larger story about what military service cost and why that cost needed to be understood rather than simply honored. As he prepared to speak publicly about the men he'd served with and the day that changed all their lives forever, he realized that healing didn't require forgetting the pain, but rather finding ways to transform that pain into something that could help others navigate their own struggles with loss and survival. The news of Marcus Thompson's presence at the Veterans Memorial Ceremony spread through Millbrook like wildfire through dry grass. Within an hour of the military convoy's departure from Sunset Diner, local social media was buzzing with speculation, photographs, and hastily shared stories about the Medal of Honor recipient who had been living anonymously in their community. The transformation from anonymous homeless man to celebrated war hero created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate participants in that morning's confrontation. Linda Rodriguez found herself at the center of unwanted attention as word spread about her treatment of Marcus. The first phone call came from her sister, Maria, who had seen a Facebook post about military vehicles at the diner and wanted to know what was happening. Linda tried to explain the situation, but every word felt like an admission of guilt, a confession that she had failed in the most basic requirements of human decency. "You threw out a Medal of Honor recipient?" Maria's voice carried disbelief and disappointment in equal measure. "Linda, how could you not see what was right in front of you? Papa always taught us to treat everyone with respect, especially those who looked like they needed help most." Linda sat in her empty diner, the lunch rush forgotten as she struggled to process the magnitude of her mistake. The morning's regular customers had left to follow the news about the ceremony, and new customers were staying away, uncertain about what they might encounter. Tony Carbone had taken over food preparation without being asked, understanding that his boss needed time to confront what had happened. The local news station arrived first, their van pulling into the parking lot with the aggressive efficiency of journalists sensing a developing story. Reporter Amanda Chen stepped out with her camera operator, immediately recognizing the diner as the location mentioned in several social media posts about the morning's events. The story had all the elements that made for compelling television: a hidden hero, mistaken identity, military honor, and the kind of human drama that resonated with audiences looking for meaning in an increasingly complex world. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Amanda Chen said, approaching the counter where Linda stood frozen with uncertainty. "I'm Amanda Chen from Channel 7 News. We understand that Medal of Honor recipient Marcus Thompson was here this morning, and that there was some kind of incident. Would you be willing to share your perspective on what happened?" Linda felt the weight of public scrutiny settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had run Sunset Diner for 12 years without attracting any significant attention, content to serve good food to regular customers and maintain the kind of low-profile business that formed the backbone of small-town economies. Now she was being asked to explain actions that she herself didn't fully understand, to justify decisions that seemed increasingly indefensible with each passing hour. "I made a mistake," Linda said quietly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the coffee machine. "I judged someone based on appearances, and I was wrong. Completely wrong." Jessica Miller had been watching the media arrival from behind the counter, her nursing school textbooks forgotten, as she processed the implications of the morning's revelations. Her brother Jake's letters from Afghanistan had described men like Marcus Thompson, soldiers who carried invisible wounds that made civilian life a constant struggle. She thought about her own assumptions, her failure to recognize the signs that might have been obvious if she had been paying closer attention. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Jessica said, stepping forward with the kind of quiet determination that had gotten her through 3 years of night school while working full-time. "Maybe we should tell the real story. Not just about what went wrong, but about what we learned." Tony emerged from the kitchen, his military bearing more apparent now that the context had been established. He had spent the morning thinking about his own transition from Navy service to civilian life, remembering the challenges of finding work and acceptance in communities that claimed to support veterans, while often failing to recognize them in practice. "The problem isn't just what happened here today," Tony said, addressing the news camera directly. "The problem is that we have heroes living on the margins of our communities, and we're so busy with our own lives that we don't see them. Marcus Thompson shouldn't have had to prove his worth to get a cup of coffee and a decent meal." Amanda Chen recognized the broader implications of the story developing in front of her. This wasn't just about one incident at one diner, but about systemic issues in how society treated veterans, how assumptions about appearance and status affected human interactions, and how recognition often came too late to address real problems. "Mr. Carboni, you're a veteran yourself, correct? How common is it for former service members to struggle with the kind of invisibility Mr. Thompson experienced?" Tony's expression darkened as he considered the question. "More common than anyone wants to admit. I was lucky. I had skills that translated directly to civilian work, family support, and benefits that actually functioned when I needed them. But I know guys who came home to nothing, no job prospects, no understanding from their communities, no recognition that their military service was supposed to mean something." The story was attracting attention beyond local media. Marcus Thompson's name was trending on social media platforms as people shared articles about Medal of Honor recipients and veteran support services. Advocacy organizations were using the incident to highlight broader issues about veteran homelessness and mental health support. The personal drama at Sunset Diner had become a catalyst for conversations that extended far beyond Millbrook, Texas. Sarah Bennett had returned to the diner after dropping her daughter at daycare, drawn by a need to understand what she had witnessed that morning. As a military spouse, she understood the challenges of military life from a different perspective, but seeing Marcus Thompson's treatment had forced her to confront her own assumptions about who deserved recognition and support. "I keep thinking about my husband," Sarah said to Jessica, as they watched the news crew set up their equipment. "David did 2 tours in Iraq, and he came home different. Not broken, just different. It took him months to readjust to civilian life, and we had all the support systems in place: family, benefits, job prospects. I can't imagine what it would be like for someone without those advantages." Jessica nodded, remembering her brother's letters describing the difficulty of transitioning between the clear hierarchies and purposes of military life and the ambiguous expectations of civilian society. Jake writes about guys who struggle with that transition. He says the military teaches you to be part of something larger than yourself, but civilian life often feels fragmented and individualistic. Frank and Dorothy Williams had also returned to the diner, drawn by the same need to process the morning's events. Frank's own military service in Korea had taught him about the importance of supporting fellow veterans, but he realized that his generation's understanding of veteran issues might not adequately address the challenges faced by more recent veterans. "Dorothy and I have been talking," Frank said, settling into his usual booth with careful movements that spoke to his advanced age. "We think the community needs to do better. Not just for Medal of Honor recipients, but for all the veterans who are struggling to find their place." Dorothy pulled out her phone, showing Jessica a news article she had found about veteran support services in Texas. "There are organizations trying to help, but they're underfunded and understaffed. Maybe what happened here today could be the start of something positive." The afternoon shift at Sunset Diner had been canceled, as Linda struggled to cope with the media attention and her own guilt about the morning's events. Regular customers who arrived for lunch found the diner effectively closed to normal business, though Linda hadn't posted any official notice or locked the doors. She seemed paralyzed by the attention, uncertain how to respond to questions about her treatment of Marcus Thompson. Robert Hayes, The businessman who had initially supported Linda's decision to eject Marcus found himself reconsidering his own attitudes about homelessness and military service. His comfortable assumptions about success and failure had been challenged by the revelation that the man he had dismissed was actually one of the most decorated soldiers in the country. "I need to make this right somehow," Robert said to Amanda Chen when she approached him for comment. "I saw what was happening this morning, and I agreed with it. I thought the restaurant owner was protecting her business from an undesirable customer. I was wrong, and I need to acknowledge that publicly." The weight of collective guilt was settling over everyone who had witnessed or participated in Marcus Thompson's treatment. Each person was forced to confront their own assumptions and prejudices, to acknowledge that their failure to see beyond surface appearances had contributed to the humiliation of a genuine American hero. Amanda Chen's news report would air that evening on Channel 7, but the story was already spreading through social media and attracting attention from national news outlets. The contrast between Marcus Thompson's heroic military service and his recent struggles with civilian life provided a compelling narrative that touched on broader themes about veteran support, societal responsibility, and the gap between public rhetoric about honoring veterans and actual treatment of those who served. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Amanda Chen said, conducting her on-camera interview in front of the diner's counter, "what would you say to Marcus Thompson if you could speak to him directly right now?" Linda looked directly into the camera, her eyes red from crying but her voice steady with determination. "I would say that I'm sorry, not just for this morning, but for failing to see him as a human being deserving of respect. I would say that he's welcome in my restaurant any time, for any reason, and that I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure this never happens to another veteran in my establishment." The promise carried weight because it was specific and actionable, but Linda realized that words alone wouldn't be sufficient to address the damage that had been done. She needed to demonstrate her commitment through sustained action, through changes in how her business operated, and how she trained her staff to recognize and support veterans who might be struggling with civilian transition. Tony Carbone had been thinking about practical steps the diner could take to become more veteran-friendly. His own experience with military service gave him insights into what would be meaningful versus what would be merely symbolic. "We could partner with local veteran organizations," he suggested to Linda during a break in the media interviews. "Offer discounts, host support group meetings, provide job training opportunities for veterans looking for work in food service." Jessica was researching veteran support organizations on her phone, discovering that Millbrook had several groups that provided services but struggled with funding and community awareness. "There's a Veterans Crisis Hotline that needs volunteers," she told Tony. "And a transitional housing program that's looking for local businesses to provide employment opportunities." The afternoon brought additional visitors to Sunset Diner, including representatives from veteran advocacy organizations who had heard about the morning's events and wanted to discuss how the incident could be transformed into positive action for veteran support. The diner was becoming an unlikely focal point for conversations about veteran issues that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Pastor Williams from Millbrook Community Church arrived with a small group of congregation members who had been discussing veteran outreach as part of their social justice ministry. The church had been looking for ways to support veterans in their community, but had struggled to make meaningful connections with those who needed help. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Pastor Williams said, his presence bringing a sense of calm to the chaotic atmosphere in the diner, "our congregation has been praying about how to better serve veterans in our community. Perhaps God is using this difficult situation to open doors for ministry and healing that wouldn't have existed otherwise." Linda found comfort in the pastor's words, but she also understood that religious platitudes wouldn't be sufficient to address the practical needs of veterans like Marcus Thompson. Real change would require sustained commitment, financial resources, and systemic changes in how the community approached veteran support. The local Veterans of Foreign Wars Post Commander, retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Hendricks, arrived in the late afternoon with a different perspective on the morning's events. She had served 3 tours in Iraq and understood both the challenges of military service and the difficulties of civilian transition from personal experience. "What happened here this morning isn't unusual," Sergeant Hendricks told the gathered media representatives. Veterans deal with this kind of treatment regularly. The difference is that Marcus Thompson's story got public attention because of his Medal of Honor. But there are thousands of veterans struggling with similar issues who will never get media coverage or community support. Her words provided important context for the developing story, reminding everyone that Marcus Thompson's experience represented a broader pattern rather than an isolated incident. The challenge would be maintaining attention and commitment to veteran issues after the immediate drama of the day's events faded from public consciousness. Dr. Rachel Martinez from the VA Medical Center in nearby Austin had driven to Millbrook after hearing about the incident on the news. As a psychiatrist specializing in veteran mental health, she understood the connection between public recognition and healing for veterans struggling with PTSD and survivor guilt. What Mr. Thompson experienced this morning at the ceremony is as important as what happened to him here in the diner, Dr. Martinez explained to Amanda Chen during an interview outside the restaurant. Veterans need both individual support and community recognition. They need to know that their service mattered and that their current struggles don't diminish their past contributions. The psychological dimension of veteran support was often overlooked in discussions focused primarily on benefits and employment. But Dr. Martinez emphasized that emotional and social support were equally crucial for successful civilian transition. The sense of purpose and community that military service provided could be difficult to replace in civilian life, especially for veterans dealing with combat trauma. As evening approached, Sunset Diner had been transformed from a simple family restaurant into an impromptu community center for discussions about veteran support and social responsibility. The morning's incident had catalyzed conversations that participants realized should have been happening long before Marcus Thompson walked through the door looking for breakfast. Linda Rodriguez stood behind her counter, looking at the diverse group of people who had gathered in her restaurant to discuss veteran issues and community responsibility. Military veterans, family members, clergy, healthcare professionals, journalists, and ordinary citizens had come together because of her mistake, but their presence offered hope that something positive could emerge from the day's painful revelations. "I want to do more than just apologize," Linda announced to the assembled group. "I want to make Sunset Diner a place where veterans know they're welcome and supported. But I don't know how to do that effectively, and I need help from people who understand these issues better than I do." Her request for assistance marked a turning point in the day's narrative, shifting focus from blame and guilt toward collaborative action and community building. The people gathered in the diner began discussing specific steps that could be taken to create meaningful support for veterans, using Marcus Thompson's story as a catalyst for broader changes in how Millbrook approached veteran services. The transformation of Sunset Diner from a site of discrimination to a center for veteran advocacy would take time and sustained effort, but the foundation for that change was being laid through conversations that might never have occurred without the morning's dramatic confrontation. Marcus Thompson's experience had revealed problems that extended far beyond one restaurant, but it had also demonstrated the community's capacity for growth and positive change when confronted with the consequences of their assumptions and prejudices. The evening news broadcast would carry the story to a wider audience, but the real work of supporting veterans and addressing systemic issues would happen in the days and weeks that followed, as the community of Millbrook grappled with what they had learned about themselves and their responsibility to those who had served their country. The incident at Sunset Diner had ended, but its implications for veteran support and community consciousness were just beginning to unfold. The Veterans Memorial Ceremony at Fort Harrison began precisely at 1100 hours with the kind of military precision that marked all official functions on the base. General Peterson stepped to the podium as hundreds of attendees rose from their seats, the mix of active duty personnel, veterans, and civilian family members creating a tapestry of American military experience spanning multiple generations and conflicts. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Memorial Plaza, and Marcus Thompson stood in the designated VIP section, his civilian clothes marking him as different from the uniformed officials, but his bearing unmistakably military despite his years away from active service. The opening remarks followed the traditional format for military ceremonies, with acknowledgments of distinguished guests, recognition of Gold Star families, and formal presentation of colors by the Fort Harrison Honor Guard. But General Peterson departed from standard protocol when he began discussing the purpose of the memorial and the importance of remembering not just the dead, but the living veterans who carried their memory forward into an uncertain civilian world. Today, we dedicate this memorial to 43 service members from our region who made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country, General Peterson announced, his voice carrying clearly across the plaza through the amplification system. But we also acknowledge that their sacrifice continues to shape the lives of those who survived, those who carry the weight of memory, and the responsibility of living up to the example set by their fallen comrades. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, as the general's words reminded him of the burden he had carried since returning from Afghanistan. The survivor's guilt that had driven him to the margins of society, the sense that his continued existence somehow diminished the sacrifice of men like Tommy Davis who had died under his command. But the conversation with Janet Davis earlier that morning had begun to shift his understanding of that responsibility, transforming it from a source of guilt into a call to purpose. The unveiling of the memorial wall created a moment of profound silence as the black granite surface was revealed, reflecting the faces of the attendees while displaying the names of the fallen in gold lettering that caught and held the morning light. Each name represented not just a casualty statistic, but a complete human life, with families, dreams, relationships, and potential contributions that had been cut short by the violence of war. Marcus found Tommy Davis's name among the others, and felt a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. Grief for the young soldier who would never experience the life he had planned, never marry his high school sweetheart, or pursue his dream of becoming a teacher, but also gratitude that Tommy's sacrifice was being acknowledged in a permanent way, that his name would be remembered by future generations who might never fully understand the cost of the freedom they inherited. Janet Davis approached the memorial wall with a wreath of white roses, her movements deliberate and dignified as she placed the flowers beneath her son's name. She touched the granite gently, her fingers tracing the letters as if she could somehow maintain physical connection with the son she had lost. Other family members followed, each placing their own memorial tributes while photographers documented the ceremony for both historical record and immediate news coverage. The moment of silence that followed stretched for exactly 60 seconds, measured by the military precision that governed all aspects of the ceremony. But for Marcus, that minute felt both eternal and insufficient. 60 seconds to honor lives that had spanned decades, to acknowledge sacrifices that would affect families for generations, to recognize the gap between public rhetoric about supporting veterans and the actual experience of those who had served and survived. When General Peterson called Marcus to the podium, the applause was respectful but not overwhelming, acknowledging his presence without creating the kind of spectacle that might make his remarks feel like a performance, rather than a genuine expression of memory and commitment. Marcus approached the microphone with the folder of speaking notes that Captain Anderson had prepared, but he set it aside without opening it, choosing instead to speak from the heart about men he had known and lost. Tommy Davis was 22 years old when he died in my arms, Marcus began, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying his words. He was excited about deploying, eager to prove himself as a soldier, proud to be serving his country in combat. He asked me questions constantly, about tactics, about leadership, about how to take care of the men in his squad. He wanted to be the kind of soldier that others could depend on. The personal approach to his remarks created immediate connection with the audience, transforming the abstract concept of military sacrifice into specific human terms that resonated with both military and civilian attendees. Marcus could see Janet Davis in the front row, tears streaming down her face, but her expression filled with something that looked like peace rather than grief. Tommy got his chance to prove himself on March 15, 2018, when our convoy was ambushed in Kunar province. When the shooting started, he didn't hesitate. He moved to assist wounded soldiers, provided covering fire for evacuation efforts, and maintained his position even when it became clear that we were outnumbered and surrounded. He died doing exactly what he had trained to do, protecting his fellow soldiers and serving his country with honor. Marcus paused, scanning the faces in the audience and seeing his own experiences reflected in the expressions of other veterans who understood the reality behind his words. The ceremony was being broadcast live on local television and streamed online, carrying his message to audiences far beyond Fort Harrison, but he was speaking primarily to the families and veterans present, people who had earned the right to hear truth rather than sanitized versions of military service. But Tommy's story doesn't end with his death in Afghanistan. It continues in the lives of the 11 soldiers who survived that ambush, in the families who remember him, in the example he set for younger soldiers who came after him. It continues in this memorial, where his name will remind future generations that freedom has a cost, and that some people are willing to pay that cost for others. The connection between individual sacrifice and collective memory was central to Marcus's understanding of military service, but he also wanted to address the ongoing struggles faced by surviving veterans, who often felt forgotten or misunderstood by the civilian society they had served. His own experience that morning at Sunset Diner provided a perfect example of the gap between public support for military service and actual treatment of veterans in daily life. This morning, before coming here, I was asked to leave a restaurant because my appearance made other customers uncomfortable. The owner didn't know I was a veteran, didn't know about my military service, and didn't know I was scheduled to speak at this ceremony. She saw someone who looked homeless and decided I didn't belong in her establishment. The revelation created visible reaction throughout the audience, with some attendees exchanging glances and others leaning forward to hear more clearly. Marcus had decided during his preparation time to include this personal anecdote because it illustrated important truths about veteran experience that needed to be acknowledged alongside the ceremony's focus on honor and sacrifice. I'm not telling you this story to criticize anyone or to seek sympathy. I'm telling you because it represents something that happens to veterans every day across this country. We struggle with civilian transition, with finding employment, with dealing with trauma that doesn't have clear solutions or timelines for healing. We become invisible in communities that claim to support us, but often fail to recognize us when we need help most. General Peterson had not expected Marcus's remarks to take this direction, but he recognized the importance of addressing these issues in a public forum where they might otherwise be ignored or minimized. The ceremony was being covered by multiple media outlets, creating an opportunity to educate civilian audiences about veteran issues that extended far beyond Memorial Day rhetoric and Veterans Day parades. The restaurant owner this morning, Mrs. Linda Rodriguez, apologized when she learned who I was. But she shouldn't have needed to know about my military service to treat me with basic human dignity. Every person deserves respect and compassion, whether they're wearing a uniform, carrying a Medal of Honor, or struggling with circumstances that are difficult to understand. Marcus could see members of the media in the designated press area taking notes and adjusting their cameras to capture his remarks, understanding that his comments were creating news beyond the standard ceremony coverage. The personal nature of his story, combined with his status as a Medal of Honor recipient, gave his words weight that might influence public discourse about veteran issues. The men and women whose names are carved into this memorial didn't die so that their surviving comrades could be treated as disposable or invisible. They died believing in ideals about service, sacrifice, and community responsibility that extend far beyond military installations and veteran organizations. They died believing that their sacrifice would create a society worthy of that sacrifice. The challenge implicit in Marcus's words was clear to everyone present. Supporting veterans required more than symbolic gestures or political rhetoric. It required sustained commitment to addressing systemic issues that affected veteran employment, healthcare, housing, and social integration. It required recognition that military service created obligations that extended to civilian communities rather than just government agencies. I survived when Tommy Davis and others didn't, not because I was braver or more skilled, but because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. That survival comes with responsibility, not just to remember the dead, but to live in ways that honor their sacrifice. That means supporting fellow veterans, educating civilian communities about military service, and working to bridge the gap between military and civilian society. The transition from personal testimony to broader social commentary marked a shift in Marcus's remarks that reflected his growing understanding of his role as both survivor and advocate. The ceremony was providing him with a platform to address issues that affected thousands of veterans, using his own experience to illustrate broader patterns that needed attention and resources. Mrs. Rodriguez and her staff at Sunset Diner have committed to making their restaurant a place where veterans feel welcome and supported. They're partnering with local veteran organizations to provide employment opportunities and support services. They're transforming their mistake into meaningful action that will benefit veterans throughout their community. The positive conclusion to the morning's incident provided hope that individual actions could create broader change. But Marcus also wanted to emphasize that such transformation required sustained effort rather than temporary gestures motivated by guilt or media attention. Real support for veterans needed to be integrated into community life rather than treated as special occasions or charitable projects. That's what honoring our fallen comrades really means. Not just remembering their names or visiting their graves, but creating the kind of society they believed they were defending. A society that takes care of its veterans, that recognizes the ongoing cost of military service, and that treats every person with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Marcus concluded his remarks by reading the names of all 43 service members memorialized on the wall, speaking each name clearly and pausing briefly between them to allow the weight of individual loss to register with the audience. The recitation took nearly 10 minutes, but no one in the audience showed signs of impatience or distraction. The names became a kind of prayer, a collective acknowledgement of sacrifice that connected the abstract concept of military service to specific human beings with families and stories. The ceremony concluded with the playing of taps by a single bugler, the haunting melody carrying across the Memorial Plaza and beyond the base boundaries to the civilian community that surrounded Fort Harrison. As the final notes faded, Marcus remained at the podium for a moment, looking out at the faces of people who had gathered to remember the dead and support the living, understanding that his own healing was connected to his ability to transform personal pain into service to others. The reception that followed the ceremony took place in the community center, adjacent to the Memorial Plaza, providing opportunity for informal conversations between family members, veterans, and community representatives who had attended the dedication. Marcus found himself surrounded by people who wanted to thank him for his service, share their own military experiences, or discuss the veteran support issues he had raised in his remarks. Janet Davis approached him with several other Gold Star mothers, women who had lost children in military service, but had channeled their grief into advocacy for veteran support and military family services. Their presence reminded Marcus that he was part of a larger community of people affected by military service, that his struggles with survivor guilt and civilian transition were shared experiences rather than individual failures. Your remarks today gave voice to things we've been trying to express for years, Janet told him, her hand resting gently on his arm. Tommy would be proud to know that his death contributed to raising awareness about veteran issues. He always wanted his service to make a difference beyond just his individual contribution. The affirmation from Tommy's mother carried special weight because it came from someone who had earned the right to judge whether Marcus was honoring her son's memory appropriately. Her approval didn't eliminate his guilt about surviving when Tommy hadn't, but it provided perspective that transformed that guilt into motivation for continued service to fellow veterans. Dr. Martinez from the VA Medical Center had attended the ceremony and sought out Marcus during the reception to discuss treatment options and support services that might help him address his ongoing struggles with PTSD and civilian transition. The public nature of his remarks about veteran issues had demonstrated both his commitment to helping others and his own need for continued support. Mr. Thompson, your willingness to speak publicly about veteran struggles shows remarkable courage and leadership, but I hope you'll also consider accepting help for yourself. The VA has expanded treatment options for PTSD, and there are support groups specifically for Medal of Honor recipients who struggle with survivor guilt. Marcus appreciated Dr. Martinez's direct approach and her understanding that accepting help was consistent with, rather than contradictory to, his role as a veteran advocate. The military culture that emphasized self-reliance and mission accomplishment sometimes made it difficult for veterans to seek assistance, but his experience that morning had taught him the importance of community support and shared responsibility. Colonel Mitchell joined the conversation between Marcus and Dr. Martinez, bringing news that the ceremony had attracted national media attention, and that Marcus's remarks were being discussed on social media platforms and veteran advocacy websites. The visibility created opportunities for broader impact, but also increased pressure and expectations that needed to be managed carefully. Marcus, I've received calls from 3 different veteran organizations asking if you'd be willing to speak at their events. There's also interest from a documentary filmmaker who's working on a project about Medal of Honor recipients and their civilian experiences. You don't have to commit to anything, but I wanted you to know that your voice is reaching people who need to hear these messages. The prospect of sustained public speaking and advocacy work both excited and intimidated Marcus, who had spent years trying to remain invisible rather than seeking platforms for his voice. But the positive response to his ceremony remarks suggested that his experiences might help other veterans feel less alone in their struggles, and might educate civilian audiences about veteran issues that desperately needed attention. Linda Rodriguez had driven to Fort Harrison with Tony Carboni and Jessica Miller, wanting to attend the ceremony and demonstrate her commitment to understanding and supporting veterans. She found Marcus during the reception and approached him with obvious nervousness, but genuine determination to make amends for her earlier treatment. Mr. Thompson, I wanted to thank you for mentioning Sunset Diner in your remarks, and for giving us a chance to do better. Tony and Jessica have been educating me about veteran issues, and I realize how much I need to learn. I hope you'll give us the opportunity to show that we're serious about change. Marcus accepted Linda's apology graciously, understanding that her presence at the ceremony represented genuine effort to address her mistakes rather than just public relations management. The transformation of their relationship from antagonistic to supportive illustrated the possibility for broader social change when people were willing to confront their assumptions and commit to sustained improvement. The afternoon brought additional conversations with veteran advocates, military families, and community representatives who had been inspired by the ceremony to discuss concrete actions they could take to support veterans in their own areas. The memorial dedication had become a catalyst for broader discussions about veteran issues that extended far beyond the immediate participants. As evening approached, Marcus found himself standing again before the memorial wall, this time alone, except for the security personnel who maintained watch over the site. Tommy Davis's name seemed to glow in the setting sun, and Marcus felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since returning from Afghanistan. The day had transformed his understanding of survival from a source of guilt into a platform for service. His phone buzzed with text messages from veterans across the country who had seen news coverage of the ceremony and wanted to thank him for speaking openly about civilian transition struggles. The responses confirmed that his experiences were shared by thousands of other veterans who had felt isolated and misunderstood in their attempts to reintegrate into civilian society. The drive back to Millbrook took Marcus past Sunset Diner, where he could see lights still on, and people gathered inside for what appeared to be a community meeting about veteran support services. Linda Rodriguez had followed through on her commitment to transform her business into a resource for veterans, and the evening gathering suggested that the morning's incident had indeed catalyzed broader community action. Marcus pulled into the parking lot and entered the diner to find representatives from multiple veteran organizations, local business owners, clergy, and community volunteers discussing specific plans for veteran support initiatives. Linda approached him immediately, her face lighting up with relief and gratitude at his presence. Mr. Thompson, we've been planning ways to support veterans in our community, and we'd love your input. We've got commitments for job training programs, mental health resources, transitional housing support, and business partnerships that could provide employment opportunities. The transformation of Sunset Diner from a site of discrimination to a center for veteran advocacy represented exactly the kind of positive change that Marcus had hoped his public remarks might inspire. The community was taking responsibility for supporting veterans rather than simply expressing gratitude for their service, creating practical solutions rather than just symbolic gestures. Tony Carbone had assumed leadership of the veteran outreach planning, his military experience and food service expertise making him an ideal coordinator for programs that needed both understanding of veteran needs and practical implementation skills. He presented Marcus with a detailed plan for making Millbrook a model community for veteran support services. "We're calling it the Tommy Davis Initiative," Tony explained, "named after the soldier you honored in your remarks today. It will coordinate veteran services across multiple organizations, provide centralized resources for veterans needing assistance, and create ongoing community education about veteran issues." The naming of the initiative after Tommy Davis felt appropriate to Marcus, transforming the young soldier's death into ongoing service to fellow veterans. Janet Davis had approved the use of her son's name and had committed to serving on the initiative's advisory board, bringing a Gold Star mother's perspective to the program development. As Marcus participated in the planning discussions, he realized that his own healing was intimately connected to his ability to serve other veterans and educate civilian communities about military service. The survivor guilt that had driven him to the margins of society was being transformed into survivor responsibility that pulled him back into community engagement and purposeful action. The evening concluded with commitments from local businesses to provide employment opportunities for veterans, from healthcare providers to expand mental health services, from housing organizations to create transitional support programs, and from educational institutions to develop veteran-specific training opportunities. The comprehensive approach addressed multiple aspects of veteran transition, rather than focusing on single issues. Marcus accepted appointment as the honorary chairman of the Tommy Davis Initiative, understanding that his role would involve both advocacy and fundraising, but also ongoing personal commitment to the veterans who would be served by these programs. The position provided him with purpose and community connection that had been missing from his civilian life. The story of Marcus Thompson's transformation from anonymous homeless veteran to community advocate would continue to inspire action long after the immediate drama of the day's events faded from public attention. His willingness to speak truthfully about veteran struggles had created opportunities for meaningful change that extended far beyond individual recognition or ceremony honors. The final image of the day was Marcus standing before the memorial wall one last time, no longer alone but surrounded by the community of veterans, families, and supporters who had committed to honoring fallen soldiers through service to the living. The names carved in granite would remain as permanent reminders of sacrifice, but the living memorial created through ongoing veteran support would ensure that those sacrifices continued to create positive change for future generations. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in the renovated back room of Sunset Diner, watching as Jessica Miller conducted her first veteran support group meeting. The space had been transformed from a storage area into a comfortable meeting room with donated furniture, motivational posters featuring military themes, and a small library of resources about veteran benefits and mental health services. The Tuesday evening meetings had become a regular fixture in Millbrook's veteran community, drawing participants from across the region who came seeking both practical assistance and emotional support. "Tonight we're going to talk about employment strategies," Jessica announced, to the dozen veterans seated around the circular table arrangement that encouraged participation rather than passive listening. "But first, let's check in with everyone about how the week went. Marcus, would you like to start?" Marcus appreciated Jessica's leadership style, which balanced structure with flexibility and created space for veterans to share their experiences without feeling pressured to perform or conform to expectations. Her nursing school training had prepared her to facilitate discussions about health and wellness, but her personal connection to military service through her brother Jake gave her credibility that purely professional credentials couldn't provide. "This week was challenging," Marcus began, his voice carrying the kind of honesty that had become characteristic of these sessions. "I had 3 job interviews, all for positions that should have been straightforward given my skills and experience. But I could tell that the employers were concerned about my employment gaps and my history of PTSD treatment. It's frustrating to feel like your struggles become disqualifications rather than evidence of your resilience." The nods of understanding around the table indicated that Marcus's experience was shared by many of the group members. Employment discrimination against veterans, particularly those with mental health histories, remained a persistent problem despite legal protections and public rhetoric about supporting those who had served. The support group provided a safe space to discuss these challenges without judgment or pressure to minimize their impact. Robert Hayes, the businessman who had initially supported Linda Rodriguez's decision to eject Marcus from the diner, had become an unexpected ally in veteran employment advocacy. His construction company had hired 4 veterans through the Tommy Davis Initiative, and he'd discovered that their military training translated into valuable workplace skills that more than compensated for any adjustment challenges. "Marcus, I've got a project manager position opening up next month," Robert said, leaning forward with the kind of direct communication style that military veterans appreciated. "It's coordinating subcontractors for a series of housing developments, and it requires exactly the kind of logistical planning and personnel management that you did in the Army. Are you interested in discussing it?" The job offer represented more than just employment opportunity for Marcus. It symbolized the kind of community support that could transform veteran transition from an individual struggle into a collective responsibility. Robert's willingness to hire veterans wasn't charity or public relations management, but recognition that military experience provided valuable skills that civilian employers often failed to recognize or appreciate. "I'd be very interested," Marcus replied, feeling the familiar flutter of hope that came with new possibilities. "I've been looking for opportunities to use my logistics background, and working with construction teams sounds like it would draw on skills I developed coordinating convoy operations and supply chains." Linda Rodriguez entered the meeting room carrying a tray of coffee and sandwiches, her presence at these sessions reflecting her ongoing commitment to veteran support rather than just symbolic gestures aimed at repairing her reputation. She had completed veteran sensitivity training through the VA and had restructured her business practices to actively support veteran employees and customers. "Excuse me for interrupting," Linda said, setting the refreshments on a side table, "but I wanted to let everyone know that next week's meeting will include a presentation from the VA Mobile Outreach Unit. They'll be providing information about updated benefits and services, and they can help with applications and appeals processes." The integration of professional services into the support group meetings had been one of the most successful aspects of the Tommy Davis Initiative. Rather than forcing veterans to navigate complex bureaucracies alone, the program brought resources directly to the community level, where they could be accessed in supportive environments with peer assistance. Dr. Martinez from the VA Medical Center had become a regular consultant to the Millbrook Veteran Support Programs, providing mental health services and training for volunteers who worked with veterans experiencing PTSD and adjustment challenges. Her presence at the diner meetings helped normalize mental health treatment and reduce the stigma that often prevented veterans from seeking professional help. "Marcus, how are you feeling about the speaking engagement next week?" Dr. Martinez asked, referring to a presentation he was scheduled to deliver at a national conference about veteran transition issues. "Remember that you can control the scope of your remarks, and that you don't have to share anything that feels too personal or triggering." Marcus had accepted several speaking opportunities since the memorial ceremony, using his platform to advocate for veteran support services and educate civilian audiences about military transition challenges. The work was emotionally demanding, but also therapeutic, transforming his personal struggles into advocacy that could help other veterans feel less isolated and communities better understand their responsibilities. "I'm nervous but committed," Marcus replied honestly. "The conference organizers want me to focus on community-level interventions rather than just federal policy, so I'll be talking about what we've built here in Millbrook as a model for other communities to adapt." The success of the Tommy Davis Initiative had attracted attention from veteran advocacy organizations across the country, with delegations visiting Millbrook to study the program's structure and implementation strategies. The combination of business partnerships, community education, peer support, and professional services had created a comprehensive approach that addressed multiple aspects of veteran transition. Tony Carbone had assumed day-to-day management of the initiative while maintaining his position as head cook at Sunset Diner, His military background and practical experience with veteran issues made him an effective coordinator, but he also brought a no-nonsense approach that kept the program focused on results rather than good intentions. "We've placed 18 veterans in permanent employment over the past 6 months," Tony reported to the group, reading from a folder of statistics he maintained for grant applications and program evaluations. "We've provided transitional housing assistance to 12 families, connected 43 veterans with mental health services, and helped 26 veterans access education benefits they didn't know they were eligible for." The numbers represented individual success stories rather than abstract statistics, and Marcus could put faces to many of the veterans who had been helped through the program. Each placement, each successful connection with services, each veteran who found stability and purpose, represented validation that the community's commitment to supporting veterans was creating real change. Frank Williams had become the informal historian of the initiative, documenting the stories of veterans who participated in the program and creating a record of both individual transformations and community evolution. His own military service in Korea gave him perspective on how veteran support had changed over the decades, but his age also reminded younger veterans that their struggles were part of a larger continuum of military service and civilian transition. "Marcus, I've been thinking about something you said in your speech at the memorial," Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of years but also the clarity of continued engagement. "You talked about honoring the dead through service to the living. I think what we've built here does that, but I also think it honors the living by giving them purpose and community." The observation touched on something that Marcus had been reflecting on throughout his involvement with the initiative. The program didn't just provide services to veterans. It created opportunities for veterans to serve each other and their community, maintaining the sense of mission and mutual support that had been central to their military experience. Dorothy Williams had organized an auxiliary support group for military spouses and family members, recognizing that veteran issues affected entire families and that successful transition required support systems that extended beyond individual veterans. Her group met monthly at the community center adjacent to the diner, providing childcare and resources specifically designed for military families. "We've learned that veteran support can't be separated from family support," Dorothy explained to a newcomer who had joined the evening session. "When veterans struggle with civilian transition, their families struggle too. When veterans find stability and purpose, their families benefit from that positive change." The holistic approach to veteran support had been one of the key innovations of the Tommy Davis Initiative, addressing the reality that military service affected entire communities rather than just individual veterans. The program's success had attracted foundation grants and government contracts that provided sustainable funding for expanded services. Sarah Bennett had returned to school to pursue a degree in social work, inspired by her involvement with the Veteran Support Program to develop professional skills that could help military families navigate civilian institutions. Her husband David had found employment through the initiative's job placement services, and their family had become advocates for veteran support throughout the region. "I used to think that supporting veterans was something other people did," Sarah reflected during the group discussion. "But I've learned that veteran support is really about community support, about creating the kind of society where everyone has opportunities to contribute and succeed, regardless of their background or circumstances." The transformation of community attitudes toward veteran issues had been as significant as the direct services provided through the initiative. People who had previously thought of veteran support as charity or government responsibility had come to understand it as community investment that benefited everyone through increased civic engagement and social cohesion. Pastor Williams had integrated veteran support into his congregation's social justice ministry, organizing volunteer opportunities and educational programs that connected military service to broader themes of service, sacrifice, and community responsibility. The church had become a partner in the initiative's transitional housing program, providing both financial support and volunteer labor for home renovations. "What we've learned," Pastor Williams told the group, "is that supporting veterans isn't just about helping individuals, but about strengthening our entire community." When we honor the service of those who defended our freedoms, we create a culture that values service, sacrifice, and mutual support. The evening's formal discussion concluded with planning for the upcoming 6th-month evaluation of the Tommy Davis Initiative, which would assess the program's impact and develop strategies for expansion and sustainability. The success of the Millbrook model had attracted attention from other communities seeking to replicate similar programs, creating opportunities for broader impact but also challenges in maintaining quality and focus. As participants began to leave the meeting, Marcus found himself in conversation with several veterans who had joined the group recently, drawn by word-of-mouth recommendations and the growing reputation of the program. Their presence reminded him that veteran transition challenges were ongoing issues that required sustained attention rather than temporary interventions. "The thing I appreciate most about this program," said Maria Santos, a Navy veteran who had moved to Millbrook specifically to access the support services, "is that it doesn't treat veteran issues as problems to be solved, but as normal parts of military transition that require community support. It makes me feel less broken and more supported." The shift in language and perspective had been crucial to the program's success. Rather than focusing on veteran deficits or pathology, the initiative emphasized veteran strengths and community responsibility, creating an environment where seeking help was seen as smart resource utilization rather than admission of failure. Marcus remained in the meeting room after the other participants had left, helping Jessica and Tony clean up and prepare for the next week's session. The routine had become meaningful to him, providing structure and purpose that anchored his civilian life in ways that individual therapy and benefits programs had never achieved. "Jessica, I wanted to thank you for taking on the leadership of these sessions," Marcus said, stacking chairs with the efficient movements that military training had made automatic. "You've created something special here, something that's helping veterans in ways that go beyond just practical assistance." Jessica smiled, her confidence in facilitating veteran support groups having grown significantly over the 6 months since the program began. "I learned from watching you at the memorial ceremony that the most powerful advocacy comes from personal truth and authentic connection. I just try to create space for veterans to share their truth with each other." The drive home took Marcus through downtown Millbrook, past the businesses that had partnered with the Tommy Davis Initiative to provide employment opportunities and services for veterans. The hardware store displayed a veteran-owned sign in its window. The barber shop offered free haircuts for job interviews, and the bookstore had created a section of military and veteran literature that served as an informal gathering place for veterans and their families. Marcus's apartment had been upgraded through the initiative's housing assistance program, moving him from transitional housing into a permanent residence that provided both independence and stability. The walls displayed his military decorations alongside photographs from community events and veteran support activities, creating a visual narrative that connected his past service with his current purpose. The evening ritual of reviewing the day's events had become a form of personal inventory that helped Marcus process his experiences and plan for future challenges. The discipline reminded him of military debriefing procedures, but the content focused on civilian life goals and community relationships rather than mission objectives and tactical outcomes. His phone contained text messages from veterans across the country who had heard about the Tommy Davis Initiative through media coverage and veteran networks. Some were seeking advice about starting similar programs in their communities, while others were simply looking for encouragement and connection with fellow veterans who understood their struggles. The national attention had brought both opportunities and challenges. Speaking engagements and consulting requests provided platforms for advocacy, but also demanded time and energy that Marcus was still learning to manage. The balance between personal healing and public service required ongoing adjustment and self-care strategies that prevented burnout while maintaining effectiveness. Dr. Martinez had helped Marcus develop coping strategies for the increased visibility and responsibility that came with his role as a veteran advocate. The work was meaningful but also triggering, requiring him to repeatedly revisit traumatic experiences while maintaining the emotional stability necessary for effective leadership. "Remember that you can't save everyone," Dr. Martinez had reminded him during their most recent session. "Your role is to create opportunities and provide support, but each veteran has to do their own work of healing and transition. You can model what recovery looks like, but you can't force it on others. The wisdom had been hard-earned through months of therapy and peer support, but it had been essential for Marcus's ability to sustain his advocacy work without becoming overwhelmed by the scope of veteran needs and the limitations of available resources. The Tommy Davis Initiative had helped hundreds of veterans, but thousands more needed similar support throughout the region. Marcus's final task each evening was updating his journal, a practice that Dr. Martinez had recommended for processing experiences and tracking progress in his own healing journey. The entries had evolved from expressions of guilt and trauma to reflections on purpose and community, documenting his transformation from isolated survivor to engaged advocate. The journal entry for that evening focused on the job opportunity that Robert Hayes had offered, and the growing recognition that Marcus's civilian life could be as meaningful as his military service, just in different ways. The work of supporting fellow veterans and educating communities about military service provided mission and purpose that connected his past experiences with future possibilities. 6 months ago, I was a homeless veteran who couldn't afford breakfast, Marcus wrote in his journal. Tonight, I'm the chairman of a veteran support initiative that's helping other veterans find stability and purpose. The change didn't happen because I got medals or recognition, but because a community decided to take responsibility for supporting the people who served them. The transformation had required both individual healing and collective action, demonstrating that veteran support was most effective when it addressed both personal needs and systemic issues. Marcus's story had become a catalyst for broader change, but the real work was being done by the many people who had committed to ongoing support for veterans in their community. The success of the Tommy Davis Initiative had proven that communities could create meaningful support for veterans when they moved beyond symbolic gestures to sustained action. The program had become a model for other communities seeking to honor military service through practical support rather than just ceremonial recognition. As Marcus prepared for sleep, he thought about Tommy Davis and the other soldiers whose names were carved into the memorial wall at Fort Harrison. Their sacrifice had created the freedom that made civilian life possible, but it had also created obligations for the living to ensure that their deaths had meaning beyond military objectives. The Tommy Davis Initiative would continue to serve veterans long after Marcus's individual involvement, creating a living memorial that honored fallen soldiers through service to survivors. The program had transformed personal tragedy into community purpose, individual struggle into collective responsibility, and survivor guilt into survivor mission. Marcus's final thought before sleep was gratitude for the second chance that Janet Davis had given him when she absolved him of responsibility for her son's death. That forgiveness had made it possible for him to transform his survival into service, his pain into purpose, and his isolation into community leadership. The story of Marcus Thompson had become the story of Millbrook, Texas, demonstrating that communities could choose to support veterans through action rather than just rhetoric. The transformation had required confronting uncomfortable truths about discrimination and neglect, but it had also revealed the capacity for positive change when people committed to doing better. The morning would bring new challenges and opportunities for the Tommy Davis Initiative, but Marcus faced them with confidence born of community support and shared purpose. The veteran who had been kicked out of a diner for appearing homeless had become a leader in creating the kind of society worthy of military sacrifice. The memorial wall at Fort Harrison would preserve the names of fallen soldiers for future generations, but the living memorial created through veteran support would ensure that their sacrifice continued to inspire positive action. Marcus Thompson's story had become proof that heroes could struggle and still be heroes, that communities could change and still be communities, and that service to others remained the highest calling for those who had worn the uniform. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.